This is Ashley Finley, and thanks for making the time to join the webinar today. This was really an idea since coming off of the conference last September. As you know, as you saw, I got about 5 minutes at the very end of a long day to say something about assessment, and really kind of left that meeting so energized with what we could be doing with these projects, and thinking that maybe one of the easy ways to think about our own capacity in this initiative was just to put together at least a couple of webinars that might hopefully not probably give you answers that you need, and so I apologize for that, but hopefully begin to nudge you to ask some more questions of what it is you want and how you might go about getting that, how you might be working more intentionally with the plans that you have and with the proposals that you've drawn up. So this is just an effort to kind of get us all collectively thinking a bit more intentionally, and then please know that after the webinar, I'm happy to field follow-up questions, ways to root whatever we talk about today in a more focused way around your individual proposals, but at least this will give you some insights into the kind of language that I use when I'm thinking about assessment. And really what we're going to do today is look at one really practical tool for organizing the work and beginning to think about what it is you want to do and what the kinds of outcomes are that you're thinking of. I should let you all know, and I can't remember if we actually preface this in one of the emails, but the second webinar will specifically be on the personal and social responsibility inventory. And I've asked Bob Reason to join that webinar and in fact facilitate most of it. And that is specifically to give you all, many of whom are participating in the consortium, and some of you who may not be and are thinking about it or just are curious about how the instrument works, just to give you more insights into what that instrument does, how it can be maximized, how it can be used and applied. And so hopefully that's just a tool though, and so hopefully by kind of taking a first look at logic models, you'll be able to get a better window into how any one tool, including the personal and social responsibility inventory, fits in for you all. Just as a quick kind of orienting for what we're thinking about here, this is always a little cartoon that I start with when I'm thinking about logic models, because the practical application of what we're trying to do on campuses is just infinitely complicated by the environment in which we are working, where if you think about the nice and robust proposals and plans that you've mapped out, you've got something like, some mapping of the outcomes, some bit about assessment, and then the problem is how do you begin to disentangle all of the multiple vectors that really have bearing, influence, relevance, in fact, to what it is you're developing, and especially when you throw in the co-curriculum. And nothing like my work with bringing theory to practice has really elevated, and particularly looking at psychosocial indicators, even civic engagement outcomes, really implicates a lot of what's happening outside of the classroom, if that's just one way to think about what's happening in the co-curriculum. So, and then obviously without that kind of intentionality of how do you make sense of all that stuff, you've got this miracle in between. So, how is it that you begin this articulation around what it is that you want, and how you just begin to organize the work in a way that is rational, logical, simplified, in a manner in which leads one to believe you have a reasonable shot at meeting those outcomes. So that's the kind of framework that I begin to think about when talking about logic models. Here's a way to kind of work through the questions that come up when we're talking through program assessment and the kind of assessment that we're doing with bringing theory to practice. I was at a camp a couple of weeks ago, and I was actually at a poster session, and there was a poster there from the library, and it's actually a remodeling project at the library at this relatively large or mid-sized state campus. And this library project, which I loved, had 19 articulated outcomes on one poster. It was a decent-sized poster, but it was still 19 outcomes. And I took one look at it actually, and I said to the person leading that, I said, what do you think are the relative? You won't impact all of these outcomes. You won't be affecting 19 outcomes at once. So what do you think are actually the more short-term outcomes here, more intermediate outcomes? What do you think are the long-term outcomes? And certainly by looking at them, you can begin to get a sense of it. But there are so many things that we want to affect with these programs. We have long-range visions. We have more immediate concerns and expectations for what a program or a project will do. So that's one place to just start. How do we begin to disaggregate outcomes across what we think will happen in relatively short and medium to long term? What are the actual activities? How do we think we're actually going to go about affecting those kinds of changes and outcomes? The evidence piece is key, not just what the tool. As many of you know, on sitting around the rooms out there, there's lots and lots of tools you can use to assess anything. And I think the real question about the evidence is what kind of evidence will be good enough to move the project forward. I think you should feel like you can ask strategic questions about the kind of evidence you need for your campus to get the engagement and ownership in your project that will get the kind of feedback you need to move the project forward. There's something to be said about good enough evidence along with valid and reliable evidence. And then certainly the resources piece, and you don't need me to raise this question, but I do hope to raise the point about how robustly you might be thinking about the resources that you have on your campus in ways that can contribute to and facilitate the project. So those are just some initial prodding questions that begin to kind of frame just the conceptual matter behind even beginning to work with logic models. It's just those kinds of questions. And one of the things that I think people struggle with a lot, I think I struggle with this too, is how do you actually define outcomes? Just the outcomes piece, which is so difficult actually and deceptively difficult in working with logic models or even with project assessment overall. And I often undervalue how difficult it is to really think about an end piece of what it means to have an outcome versus a goal versus an objective. Who knows what kinds of language you're wrestling with. So I just wanted to lift up this typology. This actually comes from Thomas Grayson's work. Hazel Simonet at the University of Wisconsin has done a lot of good work on logic models, but this is a nice framework, a nice way to think about it when you're thinking about outcomes. Just the outcomes piece is what is it that you would love to see happen in your project? What do you think is hopeful, aspirational? What would you like to see? There's still a mid-range kind of vision for that, but you feel like you ought to feel like you have a little more control over it. And then what would you expect to see? It's another way of talking about the long-term, intermediate, and short-term outcomes. It's another way to frame it, particularly as you're collaborating on these assessment plans. Ask people just these kinds of questions. And the other way to think about, particularly from the standpoint of your own projects or programs, as you're moving towards that love piece, the control you have over impacting that or affecting it with your project alone or even the people that you're sitting with right now is going to lessen, it's going to decrease over time. You assume that as you move to the love side of this, you necessarily need to involve more and more people beyond the program itself. So I know, for example, that in many of the projects or proposals that have been raised to the psychosocial initiative, you have pretty grand visions for the university and the colleges, the campuses that you're on. And to affect that kind of vision, you're going to need collaboration and help beyond just the locus of control of the individual project. So how do you move then from what you expect to impact just in your own space to moving towards a shared space or a shared control over those outcomes? So I wanted to again, underscore that as a place where, and I'm about to show you the whole logic model framework, and I won't be able to see your faces of how overwhelmed you feel in looking at it. So I would highly recommend, as you start these conversations among yourselves and then as you involve colleagues, that this is one, I think, really accessible way to start those conversations. You begin to kind of fill in the circles. And as we go through here over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to show you a couple case studies towards the end of this. I'm going to try to drill this down a little bit and personalize it a little bit, so you'll get some examples here, but keep that in mind. You'll see this slide again in a little bit. Okay, this is what I meant by the overwhelming. All right, so you are beginning to see the framework of the logic model. Dylan sent you a template that I've used in different workshops and things. It's very, very basic, actually. I will show you a fantastic resource for logic models at the end on a final resource slide from the Kellogg Foundation, if any of you have seen that. But so this is a very basic kind of context for what logic models are and how you can begin to map them out. So thinking first about long-term impact, there's absolutely a place to put your vision in. And all the time I think about, as we're thinking through assessment, what is the ultimate hope? What's the ideal hope? What's the 10-year plan, for example, for change that you're expecting to see? As you build back from that, again, disaggregating the outcomes into different kinds of time spans and visions for how those changes should occur. And even if you can't assess the ultimate impact, right? This is kind of the world peace scenario. Actually, the better one is a culture of assessment on our campuses, a culture of caring, a student learning institution. These are great and grand statements and certainly aspirational, very difficult to assess without multiple pieces sort of aligned and long periods of time. So it's great to have that vision, but then where are you working backwards to more short and intermediate outcomes to build towards that vision? I'll specify this a little bit more in a minute. If I see one thing that tends to be missing from assessment plans, it's usually the outputs. Interestingly enough, because it's so key. It's absolutely key to the whole scenario. But what counts as the evidence you need to say something about the outcomes? And it's absolutely the place to ask questions about what is good enough evidence. What is it that you can count? What is it that you can begin to quantify? And that should have some connections with the outcomes you're seeking. Again, I'm going to show you a case study in a moment to kind of give you a better vision of what it means to align and misalign some of these things. But it's absolutely a key piece. And then the activities piece is, what are the actions or the activities that students are doing to produce the outputs? So the reason I tend to see a missing outputs piece is because there's usually a focus, and you can, again, I hope you're being reflective to what you've already designed and the conversations you've already had around your own projects. But I tend to see a jump between, this is all the things that we're going to do in this project, and this is why we're doing them. And there's not that in-between piece of, and this is what students will have produced. This is that element of their engagement. This is what they would have to do to show us where the learning is actually happening or show us what the changes are. So some attentiveness to what those outputs are. And then finally, the resources piece. So what are the kinds of resources, varied and I assume expansive, not exhaustive, that will help to drive the activities piece? And here's, again, the inputs are there because you can begin to think expansively about where those inputs might be and where those resources are. That is the basic structure of a logic model of how to begin to map it out. Let me try to populate some of these cells for you so you can kind of get a window into how, at least I begin to think about these. And I'm going to show you some basic guidelines for the logic model in a second that will help with some of this stuff too. But so for example, just sort of spitballing here, kind of taking a hunch, a guess at what you all might be interested in. But what I would ask you to think about is look at the kind of language that's being used here. And you might want to crosswalk this with some of the language that you've used in your own proposal and that's hovering around your own projects or programs. This is the kind of language that's difficult to assess, difficult to see. You would have to take quite a lot of evidence, quite a lot of multivariate evidence to begin to assess any one of these things, but certainly important to articulate what that vision is. Okay, so what would it mean then to begin to build different kinds of outcomes that might lead towards any one of these impact goals? So, for example, flourishing, self-esteem, resilience. Again, I'm absolutely brainstorming here on my own about what are the different kinds of outcomes that you might be interested in, what are the kinds of indicators that you would need to see, pieces of evidence that you would need to see that would lead toward any of the long-range impact goals that you have. I've noted the resource here from the University of Pennsylvania Positive Psychology Center. I've passed this to some of you before. I actually have the direct link on the final resource slide. This is just a fantastic resource. I actually went there recently and they've made the resource page a little bit harder to find. So I've given you the direct link to the resource page. But if any of you have found it or worked with it, it's just excellent. Not all of the instruments listed there are in the public domain, but most of them actually are, and all the ones that you see listed there are. Though not sure about the self-authorship scale. Somebody might actually have might know more about that than I do, but certainly these are kinds of instruments that you could use that are out there, and that's just one of many sort of really terrific resources. Okay, so what does the output piece look like? So here's the question. So if you've got, I'm just going to go ahead and put the activities up there first. And so think about, we'll skip the outputs maybe for a second. So look at the activities, and maybe you've got some of these that you're kind of thinking about with your own proposal project. The question is, if you have students engaging in particular ways, if they're doing things that are intended to elicit their increased sense of resilience or persistence or flourishing, self-esteem, any one of another things, the question is, what are they doing to have exercised that kind of learning or that kind of transformation? And how would they have articulated it? How would they have demonstrated that? How would you know, for example? So I know Carol Day is on the line. Georgetown's got this amazing program called the Curriculum Infusion Program, where they infuse modules of well-being into the classroom. So you have all the activity and the intentionality of the activity to infuse well-being into the classroom. And then the question is, what will students do to reflect or understand or process what the intentionality of the activity is? And I know as part of this work, Georgetown has a lot of really terrific reflection papers. They've produced some multimedia work. There's some things around this, but that's what I'm getting to in terms of having that piece of the outputs and being very intentional about where the outputs are coming in. How do you expect students to engage in the actual transformation that you think is happening through the activity? Just the classic question is, just because they're doing it doesn't mean they're learning anything. So how is that actually being translated? And then a quick glance at some of the potential inputs that you might be looking. You all have programmatic inputs, I'm sure. You've got grant money for one. That's a definite input. But I also assume that as you're thinking about the scope and the long-term sustainability of the work, that you're beginning to think about where do the outcomes and certainly the impact goals that we have here, where does that begin to crosswalk with different areas of campus that are probably interested in exactly the same things, where we might be able to better align our goals. And I think particularly with the kinds of projects you all are working on, great opportunities to think both curricularly and co-curricularly about the resources that are out there. So great opportunities there. So that's just beginning to populate the logic model and give you some examples. we're recording the webinar, and obviously we can send around the slides really easily, so you certainly have these if you're taking notes or whatever. But that's just a window. Let me put up just a few of the basic principles here and how you want to develop. And I've kind of hinted at some of these, but let me be clear and explicit about them. Logic models should be developed collaboratively. So the fact that you're all working in teams, you have project teams that you're working with, you've got colleagues that you might want to involve in this work, is fantastic from the perspective of you really do want multiple perspectives influencing what might constitute an output. How do you begin to articulate the outcomes? You really want all of that input to make it more difficult. In fact, we were just having a conversation here at AAC&U about some assessment work that we're doing in-house, and I was encouraging my colleagues here to think extensively about how other perspectives around the organization might add to and complicate and test certain assumptions that were being made. So, logic models are really, and there's a reason that you want part of that collaboration. It's actually going to facilitate the next things I'm going to list out here, one of which is to begin to simplify as much as possible what it is you intend to do. So they're not necessarily meant to be written in 2-point font, as small as you can and cram as much language as you possibly can. It really is meant to sort of strip out as much of the language as possible so that you can actually use this as a communication tool. And you might want to think about how they could be put in front of different audiences, or different things might get emphasized for different audiences, but they really were intended to function as a communication tool, maybe within your own project team, but then certainly for wider dissemination. You all are working with students. You've got students at the core of these projects. I know over at Wagner, we've got a couple of students at least on the line that are listening in. What does it mean to put your plan in front of students, to lift up layers of transparency around what the project is intended to do and what the ultimate goals are? So logic models can be really helpful in just that transparency piece at the same time. Logic models are meant to be attentive to the maturation of the project over time. So, for example, I give examples all the time. Well, Georgetown's Curriculum Infusion Project is a great example of this. It's a great program, and it's also been going for about 8 years or so now. So it's had some time to work through kinks, to figure out how the implementation plan goes, figure out recruitment, standardize the implementation process. Standardize, probably not a good word, but think through the implementation process. So as you, even as the language of the logic model might change over time, but it's meant to suggest that in year one of a project, you can and should probably get much different kinds of results than you would at 10 years into the project. There's just a certain level of articulation around what outputs are needed, what kind of evidence is needed, the resources that you have, and it's a way to let you off the hook a little bit around the kinds of data that you might reasonably expect to see in a certain amount of time, and be attentive to what that maturation process will look like. And there's no magic time limit here. I did hear once that you can't expect anything to really happen from reform efforts in less than 5 years. Obviously, somebody took a big guess at that. It's reasonable, though. That makes sense to me. I think it's certainly more reasonable than in year one, for example, something like that. So do be attentive to that. And I do think this point influences many of the kinds of projects that you have that might already be going, actually. And that is the case for some of you out there, that you're working with programs that are already in place, and you're making them more intentional or doing something more with them. And for some of you out there, these are brand new programs and projects that you just haven't worked with before. So we're keeping that in mind too. This one's probably pretty obvious, but there's another reason not to start with the inputs and to start with the outcomes. Obviously, the obvious one is that you always want to know where you're going, and you want to be clear and defined as much as you can about what the objectives are. You also don't start with the inputs so that you don't arbitrarily limit or constrain the vision. So this, and I do think at this point in higher education, this is what we have to think about, is not thinking in such constraint around our resources that we don't allow ourselves to dream a bit, to think about what's the big vision for what we're after. I only have $5, so I'm just going to maximize my $5, rather than thinking through what it is you really want and thinking backwards to the point of being able to say, okay, well, now that I see how the plan's actually mapped out, how many resources do I actually have? Where might I be able to draw upon other resources that I hadn't actually considered? I've got $5 over in this bucket and $5 over here that I hadn't considered that I could use for this, for example. And that is the point of working backwards, is to have a much fuller scope and range of vision of what you're thinking about in terms of how the resources actually fit into what the vision is as articulated. And this, I think, is on the template that you have, but just to keep in mind that part of the reason that logic models are developed collaboratively is because everybody is bringing assumptions to the table. Everybody has expectations and perceptions about how the institution works, what the culture is, levels of engagement, levels of ownership, levels of buy-in, for lack of a better word. All sorts of assumptions get made around what are really resources, what are really not. And it's helpful to have people bring in different sets of assumptions and challenge each other's assumptions at the same time. But it's really helpful to understand that we're often making very key assumptions on how we're putting any part of the logic model together. Everything from that we all agree on the outcome that we're seeking. You might have started thinking that, and then once you all articulate an outcome, you find that it's quite different language. That's helpful to understand, all the way backwards, again, towards what may or may not actually be resources. So just some basic principles there. 2 case studies. This is, I'm going to show you one that I think we might all agree could use a little more work around intentionality, and then one that's getting a little bit closer. And these, again, just to kind of show you how the language you're already, I'm going to show you exactly language pulled from either, the first one is a interim grant report, and the second one is a actual proposal. And you'll see, I'm actually not going to identify the first institution, but you will see the second one, because it's with their consent. And so I haven't played at all with the language, and so I really wanted, and that was important to me so that you could see how your language, and what I would say is the language I think we tend to use on campus quite a bit, could begin to get translated. This is one of our project campuses. This is a Bringing Theory to Practice project campus, not necessarily for this initiative, but it's one of those campuses. And you'll kind of get a sense of what they're looking at just from the language. Again, you're going to see we're working at a community engagement program. Obviously, we have our own language on campuses, how we name things, how we give titles and labels. But just to kind of give you an idea of what this program's doing, it's a small group of students who are going to be trained. They're looking at sensitivity issues, both within their community and then on the campus. The community engagement students are basically being trained and then going into classrooms, but this will give you a little bit idea of kind of the language that they're using to frame this, at least to us, and we assume that they're using this on campus as well. Okay. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? I think we agree on that. You're going to see a heavy context for challenging discrimination, diversity with these civic engagement students. And again, think about this pretty small scale program at this point, but then obviously you see that there's kind of a whole campus community context for this. And if you couldn't tell, again, this language is lifted directly from project proposal. Or not proposal, actually, this is an interim report. So I'm beginning to clue in. So, example, if I begin to translate this into logic model frameworks, I'm going to start looking for how do I begin to see where the outcomes are. And really what you're seeing, I think, and mine is not the definitive voice here, but I'm seeing a lot of impact goals, right? These are pretty big, long-ranging sorts of, this is big change. This is big time change for this campus. We're really talking about a paradigm shift, if you will. It's going to take, you think about that locus of control and how that moves out. So if we move to something back to that original slide from early on, we begin to populate what we see here. I don't know where exactly I would put this stuff, but I'm guessing it's somewhere in here. And I'm thinking it's probably more to the love side, right? This is more aware of politics of power, root historical causes for social issues, consciousness of alternative choices of engagement, and create more whole campus community better prepared for wider engagement. All language that you just saw on the previous slide, but if I begin to translate that into actual operational, accessible kinds of outcomes, I got to put it over to the side of, I'm giving them more credit on the like side, because I do think there's elements of consciousness of, you could actually measure different kinds of engagement, for example. That's measurable for sure. But these other things seem a little wide-ranging. And remember, it's all coming from one relatively small-scale program. So if you're picking up what I'm putting down, this is the kind of language that, and I don't think this campus is unique in terms of the kind of language that we use that makes things, well, of course, sound good, but really imply a larger vision for what's happening. But then a lack of coherence between what a program itself can actually do and what's the larger impact goal, right? So the question that gets raised for me in beginning to translate this into a logic model, I'm going to show you many more steps here in a second, but as we move towards that love piece, as we move towards this paradigm shift that's clearly envisioned for the entire campus as a result of this pretty small program that involves about 12 students right now, who else do we need? Who else would have to be pulled into this equation as we're moving towards that? And that's not like you get solved in year one by any means, but there should be at least something between the program itself and then this larger vision for the campus and this change in language and so forth. So you wouldn't have any reason to have seen this, but I have seen what, and again, there's a lot going on here, what their actual sort of project is and what they've laid out. So I'm just going to put all this up. This is all, again, actual language that's come from their project report. And so you see impact goals obviously listed there, and this is a translation, again, of what you just saw on the previous slide. And then the pink here is their actual proposed evaluation plan. And again, if you're thinking about your own work, you're thinking about how you might have already laid out your proposed assessment plan. Think about if you can see the outcomes in the instruments you're using and their connection with the impact goals, for example. How have you articulated, and so I put it all in pink there because the outcomes themselves haven't actually been articulated. I can't find anything between the impact goals and activities in reading this campus's project report. What I do see is their evaluation plan, and of course from an assessment standpoint, I assume that outcomes are connected with the instruments that are being used, but how should I interpret how those assessments are being used in ways that actually match up with the impact goals? So you see, and they're fairly reasonable evaluation plans. So you've got program evaluations. There's a mention of flourishing. That shouldn't surprise any of you, but I do think somebody on that campus would be surprised by that. And quite frankly, I'm more concerned about that than I am for us as a national project. I know why we've encouraged them to use flourishing, but I don't know that they know why they're using flourishing. And so it doesn't help very much that they're using it as an instrument in this case until they've actually connected it to a more robust part of their outcome articulation and impact articulation. And this one, I love this example because you know, raise your hand out there. Don't, because I can't see you, so don't. I'm just kidding. You're using, did somebody raise their hand? A lot of you are using NESI and SERP on your campuses. I know Amanda's on the line from Chattanooga State, so they might be using CESI over at Chattanooga State as a 2-year institution. Just thinking through what your institutional data might be, and you absolutely should do that, absolutely thinking about the data and the resources that you already have that could be linking to this. However, right, there's a big but or a however here, which is, do those instruments actually give you the data that you need that can be linked to the outcomes you're looking at? NESI is an excellent instrument. It's about as broad as you get. It's about as close as we get to a common instrument in higher education, but it is what it is, which is a fairly broad survey. So I assume some much greater intentionality than just listing NESI or SERP, for example. What are the actual items? What are the actual scales within either of those instruments that would actually be used? Outputs. I mentioned it earlier. It came up again when I read this project report. There's absolutely no outputs listed at all. So if you look at the activities, which seem related, which seem a part of what's happening, but I can't see what the student should have actually done from those activities to begin to translate anywhere that would have any impact on why their program evaluations would be higher, why their flourishing would be higher, why any of their engagement or SERP, engagement on the NESI or SERP scales would be higher, for example, just because they participated. So hopefully, I don't know, that probably could go on there, but I'm not sure what you're thinking about this, but I tried to illuminate there in the brackets. Those are the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about when I see these missing output pieces. Where's the translation piece for students? And I just thought, so let me pause here and then pause here. You can kind of think about that for a second. And then looking at the input piece, again, this is actually, I'm lifting stuff directly from their project report, and you see the Civic Engagement Advocates program as just an input listed. And then we've got multiple kinds of inputs, again, all identified. This isn't me scooting around their website, but this is actually some of the things that they've identified as potential areas of resources that are mentioned. They didn't articulate them as resources, but I'm thinking through how they might actually be used as resources. So again, you can think about this a little bit more, and if any of you are raising questions that are just coming into me privately, please know that if I don't respond to those right now, I'll definitely go back and I'll send you follow-up emails on that because we have the chat recorded. So that's one example. And before I get to the next example, I wanted to show you, just at the risk of completely overwhelming you, but this might have come through as you started to, for example, if you look back at these impact goals for something, they're really talking about the whole campus community. And I know in a lot of your projects, you're thinking both at students and then beyond the student level for how these outcomes might be impacting the campus. And I'm going to show you an example of this in a second. But it's one thing to ask yourself if you're actually thinking about student level outcomes, faculty outcomes, and institutional outcomes. That's just another way that you can keep organizing the work that you're doing. So for example, and then you can begin to, you could make an individual, I would encourage this, actually an individual logic model for each of those layers, but here's just one way to begin to kind of keep teasing out what's happening and how you might be more intentional at multiple layers to actually affect the eventual outcomes that you're getting. There's a lot to look through on that slide, so I apologize for that. But I wanted to kind of give you a vision of how you might begin to disaggregate it. So this is the last case I'm going to show you, and we'll wrap up here in about 4 minutes. So I'll give you, if you've got questions that you want to ask, I want to make sure we don't go over time. So with thanks to Team Dartmouth, we had an initial conversation a little while back, and we talked about a logic model. We talked about what they're all working on in this Mentoring with Purpose project. I should put that in quotes. That's the name of the actual project. Here's just a little bit about it. I've actually lifted this as language from the project proposal. And Dylan, I should ask, have we shared the project proposals out? Can everybody see project proposals? Okay.
We can. We haven't.
Okay, so we can do that. We haven't done that yet. So I'm sure Helen and Jay would probably be willing to share this with everybody, so you can kind of get a closer look at how they're mapping this out. But you can see what I saw actually. So here's just a sense of what this is, this project, and I won't do it justice right here, but It essentially is intended to be a more intentional look at the mentoring that's already happening on campus. It's a way to actually combine mentoring activities that are already happening into a more intentional, cohesive, and holistic mentoring program. And you can see this coordinated mentoring effort. You get a sense here of how they're beginning to list. I'm going to fill in some things here as you're reading through, getting a basic sense of or the characteristics of what the program do. But what I wanted to, well, I asked Helen and Jay a couple of things why I could use this. One, because they've already started to map out a logic model, but two, because I really like their intentionality to talk about multiple layers of outcomes here. There actually is an assumption moving into this project that not just students are going to be impacted, that they actually are thinking about not only faculty, not only staff, but also community leaders as well. And that's ambitious. That takes a lot, but also at the same time, I really appreciate that kind of forward thought around who is it that we really think is going to be impacted by this program, and ultimately who's included in the long-term vision of what we're looking at. Again, those are just layers of intentionality. So just looking at this initial slide, so I'm thinking, again, I'm not the definitive voice here. This is why you do logic models collaboratively. But if I'm beginning to look at this, I thought, oh, well, you know, this looks a little bit like an impact statement to me. What do we think the long-range kind of efforts are going to look at like here? What might look like more short-term outcomes? This kind of cascade fashion, how we might begin to map out outcomes related to the layers of mentoring that are happening and gauging those. This looks like a whole this looks a lot like an activities kind of statement to me. This little passage or this little bullet point gives the indication of what's actually being done to influence that. And then this looks starting to look a little like a resources piece, and then with an impact statement at the end. But one way, even if you didn't start, for example, mapping everything into a logic model, how you might just begin to take a chunk of text that might look a little bit like your proposal or other kinds of documents that you're producing from your project, and just begin to start teasing out and separating different areas or dimensions what you see happening there. What I've done here is actually not listed language directly from the proposal, but this is actually language coming directly from Helen and Jay's logic model that they've developed, and actually with a kind of differentiation between outcomes for everyone, from students, faculty, and then community leaders is the CL part of that there. And you're seeing outputs go into, you're seeing a lot of indirect evidence coming from surveys, for example, and then some countables of how they're actually counting people, for example, that are in the program. But excuse me, what I like about this output piece is that it's a little bit more directly related than you saw in the previous example. You can begin to see at least where, at even a beginning level to do the project, they really are going to get some data. They're going to be able to say something about the program and its efficacy. I assume that these outputs will get more targeted, more centered as the project goes on, but you're at least getting a sense of a kind of continuity, hopefully a little bit here. These are a whole list of the activities that are planned. These really range. You see an assessment and write a summary report at the end. So you're seeing kind of a whole kind of combined list of what activities are. So I was just putting those all together. And in fact, they really aren't quite at the student level so much that you might expect, as some of the other examples gave you a window into. But it's just, I appreciated this was just like another way to think about the logic model, probably from, pretty much more in terms of their own project standpoint or the project group standpoint. And then you're seeing some of the inputs that they've listed. I want to flag the very first one, which is that they have a new president with a strong commitment to experiential education. I absolutely agree that's a resource. It's absolutely an assumption, right? You're all smiling out there. This is, and I don't know. And this is where, if I was sitting with the project team, and I know Helen's on the phone, is to say, do we all agree on that? Okay, great. We agree. Everybody, we've got a strong commitment to experiential education. But it's that's what I mean by flagging the parts of the model as somebody develops it or it's developed in chunks to say, how much are we assuming here and how much do we know for sure? So, but again, a wonderful list of thinking through the resources across campus. So again, a lot of text there that you can reflect on, but hopefully it begins to kind of give you an idea on what's happening and how any one of your individual proposals could start to get mapped out. The other thing I should mention quickly here, logic models are just a heuristic. They're just a tool. I don't ever mean to imply, I don't want to imply that there's an absolute between what's an impact, what's an outcome, what's an output. Just the difference between something that's an input and an activity can be a gray area. So all of these things can be gray areas. Again, that's why they should be done collaboratively. Okay. Just a few final questions, and then we'll open it up for some brief questions and maybe respond to some of the questions that have already been raised. So final considerations, again, this is just in a kind of summary, separating long-term goals from short and intermediate. How do you envision the activities of the program? And are you considering what would happen at the faculty or even the institutional level? I don't, again, think all these things would happen in year one, but it's worth raising the conversation about are these areas of intentionality that you want to be committed to. I kind of flip-flop the activities piece and the inputs piece. Sometimes I think it's easier to get to the outputs, or the output piece. Easier to get the outputs by looking at the activities, but what are students asked to be doing from the outputs? What's going to be counted as evidence? And what other evidence do you need to affect that? And then what resources, both that exist, and then what are needed to change and to impact the kinds of questions the kinds of activities that you envision. So I'm going to pause there, and that was a lot to run through. So any questions, and I'll scroll here for a second just to kind of look at questions, but please feel free to raise anything. I'm going to put up a resource slide right now that might be helpful for any of you. The first one is the Kellogg Foundation website that I mentioned. You all should know that there's the Bringing Theory to Practice Toolkit instrument on our website that has the flourishing scale attached to it. It has a bunch of other things as well. But if you want to just find a place to look at the flourishing scale, below that is a link to the Positive Psychology Center at UPenn. Below that is what we definitely don't have time for today, but if any of you on your campuses are working with any of the AAC&U value rubrics that were developed by campuses, not by campuses, people on campuses, and but those help expand the assessment plans you might be thinking about in terms of building in direct assessment. We see a lot of indirect assessment with these projects, which is good. It certainly advances what we're doing, but to be considering how direct assessment might work in. And if you haven't looked at or you're not involved with the Wabash study, or formerly what was the Wabash study, their list of assessment instruments is just fantastic. So that's an excellent resource if you're looking for additional kinds of assessments, both for learning and also actually the entire span of what Bringing Theory to Practice does. They have assessments on civic engagement and psychosocial well-being as well. Let me pause there. Does anybody have questions that you want to raise? There's a question on outputs, that outputs tend to overlap with activities or outcomes, and how do we differentiate outcomes from the other categories? Why, for example, is number of students who participate in the program not an activity, and why is the survey not an outcome? And so let me tackle that one. For example, why is the number of students who participate in a program not an activity? Usually, and it could be, it could be, but I think when we're thinking about the activities, it's more about what the students are actually doing in that space and how many of them are actually participating. So the activity piece is meant to lift up intentionality about what the engagement is supposed to look like itself that would lead towards the desired outcomes. I do think surveys are outcomes. I would just be clearer about what the actual outcome is. And this is again something I find in working with Bringing Theory to Practice is people list surveys on assessment plans without saying what the actual outcome is that they think the survey addresses. So it's just an instrument, and I want to see what the actual outcome is. And again, as you're thinking about these as communication tools, I assume your colleagues will care far more about what the articulated outcome is than the name of a survey. So that's one way I would differentiate that. In the spirit of knowing many of you and interacted and worked with you all for a long time, I know you're out there. And I want to thank you all very much for doing this. This is the first time that we've tried anything like this, and so appreciate the time and the effort that you're putting into your individual projects. We just really wanted to be more intentional about what we're doing to raise the notion of a learning community, what that really means to be connected, and webinars just really are a nice, accessible way to do that. Send me any emails or let me know how I can be of help working through some of these questions, or if any point I can offer resources. I'm happy to do that and welcome the opportunity to do so. So I'll just say thanks so much to all of you for joining, and enjoy the rest of the day. We appreciate your time.